Hi and welcome back to the channel. Yes, it's Science Fiction Saturday, so I'm going to do science fiction as promised. And in this case I'm going to be doing three kind of obscure science fiction movies made over the last decade and a half, which I've been watching lately and which I appreciated watching lately. I did try to find some other movies by trolling through the back catalogues of Netflix and Amazon Prime and even Tubi, and nothing I found grabbed me the way these three movies did. So I'm going with them instead of the usual alien invasion, junkyard kind of films that seem to be happening a lot in various areas of the streaming services. Two are Australian, one is Russian, so we're not going anywhere near North America for these ones. And they're not big budget action films, though. Let me see, two of them are kind of action films. We've got a science fiction action film, we've got a science fiction horror film, and we've got a straight up science fiction film, which is kind of a nice balance, which should, I think, settle the arguments that I'm going to have on whether particular movies are science fiction or not. Let's do the Russian one first. This one was produced by Timur Bekmambetov, who we know from doing Night Watch and Day Watch. He also did that movie Wanted with James McAvoy and Angelina Jolie in it. And since then he's been doing more projects in his part of the world than in North America, which is okay. With COVID you really don't want to be any place you don't have to be. It also has a few actors that turned up in Night Watch and Day Watch, about which I had spoken previously. And it is a movie called Black Lightning. Not to be mistaken for the American TV series, which I highly recommend as well. If you haven't been binging Black Lightning, I think you're missing out a little bit. There's a bit of depth there, but I'm not talking about that at the moment. It was made in 2009 and didn't do a hell of a lot of business, so it did enough business to get a Blu-ray release here in Australia. Now, Black Lightning's about a university student called Dmitri, whose father finds in an underground vault underneath Moscow during a construction site an old car, and that car is, I've got to look this up because I'm not good with cars. It's an old Volga Gaz 21 from 1966. It's a shitty old enormous Soviet tank of a car, which apparently was a good car at the time. It had a few things that other Russian cars didn't have. Volga Gaz 21s were very well known for having really good rust proofing, which of course you need in that kind of climate. And they also had great suspension, and this one definitely shows that. And so Dmitri, who really likes a girl called Nastya, who his rich friend also likes, so there's a bit of a love triangle going on there, gets the old car and starts making money by delivering flowers around the place, and then finds out that it's actually a Russian Soviet era secret project. A Russian space probe found some materials on the moon that increased the power of any fuel source, and the scientists working on this project basically made a flying car. And they couldn't quite get it to work, but for some reason it does work now. Maybe it's had time to kind of marinate in its own juices, who knows. And suddenly Dimitri's got a flying car. And meanwhile, an evil scientist is drilling down into the foundations and the caves underneath Moscow to find some diamonds, because, rich oligarchs in Russia like diamonds. But there's not enough power to get them through to where the diamonds are. He needs the nano catalyst and the nano fuel that this particular car generates. And so he goes up against Dmitri in the usual kind of superhero battle that we get. It's kind of a little bit of a cross between Spider-Man and Iron Man. Instead of having the Green Goblin, we get a Russian oligarch. And instead of having the Green Goblin's son, we have Dimitri's friend, who is rich and more than a little bit of an arsehole. But nonetheless, it's kind of, I kind of like the way they mash the successful bits of American films and do their own kind of thing. And there are some really great moments in this. There's a battle between a version of the flying car that the Russian scientist oligarch makes versus the old Volga over Red Square on New Year's Eve, which is kind of filmed really well. The special effects in this are really good for the time. There are a couple of bits where it's CG, but they really make the flying car believable. The characters are believable, and the characters very much reflect the culture in which they come. They're not just cut and pasting American culture into this movie, they are doing it right. It's a good, solid action film. It doesn't have anywhere near the budget of a Marvel film, but it's very much entertaining. It's got the sweet love interests. It's got a couple of imaginative action sequences which are put together very well. There are little bits and pieces in the background. There's a guy who's an alcoholic who sees a flying car, and by the end of the movie, him and his two drunken mates go out for a jog and are trying to get healthier and are off the grog because they don't want to see hallucinations anymore. There are some bits and pieces in this that work quite well. I'll give you a closer look at the cover. But I like the old car. Actually, I wouldn't mind having a Volga Gaz 21 if it was an automatic, of course. But it has a very groovy kind of Soviet atom punk look to it, particularly on the dashboard. And I kind of appreciate that. I like the look of old technologies from other cultures. That one's a kind of soft recommend from me, Black Lightning. See if you can find a copy of it. See if you can find it on a streaming service. A lot of these things, particularly action films from other cultures that occurred 12 years ago, don't stick around on streaming services for very long, which is a bit of a shame. There's that constant need for new content in particularly Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Universal and Paramount Plus and all those other ones, which is a bit of a shame because there is some good stuff that's just that little bit over the horizon and that people quite easily forget. Let's move on to the first of the two. I'm going to leave the best one for last. Let's look at the first of the two Australian ones. This one was filmed in Perth, Western Australia, which, for the people who like that kind of trivia, is the most isolated city over 1 million people in the world. It's not easy to get to. It's 3,500 kilometres from here, and it's pretty much 3,500 kilometres from anywhere. But I like it, and I like a lot of the people there, so hi to anyone in Perth. This one's an alternate universe story. In fact, the next two have alternate universes in some ways in them. It's on a fairly low budget. It's a very personal story with a female lead, and it is called The Gateway. Now, in some markets, The Gateway is called Alpha Gateway for reasons best known to the sort of people who think up titles like that. And it stars Jacqueline McKenzie as a particle physicist who's working on teleportation. And they decide to teleport an apple because apples are your go-to thing. They're the reference to Isaac Newton and all that kind of stuff. So her and her lab assistant, Reg, teleport an apple, but it doesn't show up at the other end, kind of like the kitten in the original version of The Fly. They go home, and she's very happily married. She has 2 kids that are teenagers and almost adults. She has a loving husband who works from home and who is an artist. And her and her husband, because she works such long hours, meet up at lunchtime at a local park and have lunch together. So she goes to the local park one day and he's not there. And she finds out that he on his bicycle has been hit by a car and he dies. So she goes into a deep funk. She's grieving, she's drinking too much, she's not looking after the family. And she really is on a downward spiral until she finds out where the apple goes. The apple is going to an alternate universe. So she sends a message to that alternate universe saying hi, basically, and gets back a note saying hi. And so she sends an old video camera through, and it comes back with footage of a very different teleportation setup. The technologies in this other world are quite different. And so she decides to send herself to the other universe.
Mark's theory.
Parallel worlds.
We could go across.
Okay, taking it to 200.
And then she finds out that her equivalent in the other universe has died, and her husband is grieving for his version of her. On impulse, she brings him back to her universe and introduces him to her family, but things aren't quite what they seem. Now, there's lots of good stuff in here. I'm not going to go any more into spoilers because there are a few nice little twists in this. And there's a nice little coda at the end of the film that I really liked. But Jacqueline McKenzie is great. Having a middle-aged woman as a protagonist in this sort of film is something that most people wouldn't do. They'd get a younger woman or they'd get a guy to play. But Jacqueline McKenzie is really great in all aspects of her character. The grieving process, the happily married woman, the person who is trying to fix the problems that occur after she brings her husband back from the other universe. And Miles Pollard as her husband gives us both versions of the husband really nicely. The supporting cast is solid. The look of the film is good. They do the usual thing, which is to have a different color palette in the other universe. It's skewed a little more to the kind of blues and greens, but it works well, and the twists and turns are really nice. There's nothing here that's groundbreaking particularly, but it's a slightly familiar story with a lot of little kinks and twists done quite well, and I think it deserves a little more love than it got. I had a little trouble finding a copy of this. I eventually went to JB Hi-Fi and had them send it out, but it's one I'm going to keep. There are a few Australian movies that I think punch above their weight in science fiction. One of them, of course, is These Final Hours, which again was set in Perth, Western Australia, but is a really nice end-of-the-world story. And there's this one. So give Gateway, also known as Alpha Gateway, a go if you can, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Chucks it over there. The last one is from 2009. It's by an English writer-director called Christopher Smith, which is a name that nobody's going to remember, and it was filmed in Brisbane, in Queensland here in Australia, up north, which is that way. And it's got time loops galore. It is really a mad movie. It can be seen in some ways as a horror film, in some ways as a tragedy. It makes one big mistake, and I'll tell you what that is at the end of the review. And it's a movie called Triangle, starring Melissa George, Michael Dornan, and Liam Hemsworth in an acting role before his brother got famous playing Thor. This one's from 2009, and it's a solid horror movie. If you like horror movies, you're going to like it. If you like movies with time loops in it, you're going to like it. If you like dramas and you're not necessarily into science fiction or time loops, you're going to like this one as well. Melissa George plays Jess, who's a single mum with an autistic child. She's invited on a date on the boat of a rich man, played by Michael Dornan, who's got a boat that he's going out on a cruise. So Jess and a couple of his rich friends get invited on this boat to go out to sea and just have a weekend away. By the way, it's windy outside. If you can hear any noises, that's the wind. They get on the boat, and Jess is very distracted and very tired. She's a single mum working full-time and caring for an autistic son, so she's exhausted all the time. A really mysterious storm brews, and you can hear it outside. A really mysterious storm brews up and capsizes the boat, and all but one of the people on the boat survives. A very nasty kind of battering by the storm, which suddenly disappears, and they're stuck on a capsized boat. Out of the fog comes a cruise ship, a great big one, looking slightly rusty and slightly kind of ramshackle, that drifts beside their boat. They jump on board and find that there's nobody on this ocean liner. It's a big, slightly old-fashioned one. There's a buffet laid out. There's all sorts of things suggesting that people had just left the place. And there's a killer on board, and they don't know who it is. And that's when the time loops start manifesting in the lives of all of these people. And Jess becomes the final girl, in a sense, but she also plays a number of other roles in it. Now, Melissa George is really good in this. Michael Dornan, who people think is an American actor, but he's actually a New Zealander, is good. Liam Hemsworth is kind of hunky and chunky the way Hemsworths often are. And it's got a nice script that takes us through various versions of the events occurring, seen from the viewpoints of different people at different times in their time loops. And that's kind of cool. It's not a big film. It's not a spectacularly successful film. In fact, it only just covered its costs when it came out. But I think it's a really nice one. It's memorable. And the lovely thing we find out at the end, and this isn't a spoiler, it's more just a suggestion of what's happening. The time loops start a lot earlier than Jess thinks. And that makes it really interesting. And we eventually see the whole progress of Jess's life from the beginning of the day up until she's on the ship and all the events that happen afterwards. It's got a little bit of stuff that may have been slightly borrowed from a Spanish science fiction movie called Time Crimes, but it does its own thing with those little bits that it borrows. It is very much its own movie, and it very much is a tight thriller. There are some really shocking moments in it which are totally in tune with the kind of movie it is, and that when I first saw it I was blown away by. It really does give us a creepy, eerie world. We don't know whether this is kind of a scientific phenomenon or whether it's a kind of supernatural afterlife kind of phenomenon. It's a bit hard to tell, and the ambiguity there actually works to strengthen the movie rather than weaken it. So, of the three, I think Gateway and Triangle I would really recommend. Now, the thing that doesn't work in the movie, and the thing I think is a kind of mistaken choice by the filmmakers, is they filmed it in Brisbane, and it's pretty clearly Brisbane and the Surfers Paradise and the Gold Coast, but they pretend it takes place in Florida, and there are some kind of janky American style accents imposed upon the actors. I don't think that was necessary. I don't think that even to get American sales you needed that. And I think it's something that movie makers should look at. You don't have to pretend. If you're making a movie in a particular country, don't pretend it's America. You don't have to do that. If you lose a few idiots who don't like movies that aren't set in America, too bad. You're going to gain other people if you just concentrate on the stuff that's really important in the story and the movie that you're making. So there are three movies that I recommend. They're kind of not A-level science fiction movies, but they're watchable, they're fun, they're going to keep you entertained. Now, before I go, a friend of mine, Graham Garfield Barnard, died yesterday. Now, Garfield was known in science fiction circles, particularly here in Australia, as Nigel Honeybone, the skeleton host of a horror movie series on... I'm sorry, I'm doing this badly. As he was Nigel Honeybone, the skeletal host of the schlocky horror picture show, which was a kind of horror host, schlocky old science fiction public domain movie show that went for many years on community television here in Australia. Now, Garfield was a lovely guy. He was generous to other people. He was curmudgeonly like the rest of us at times, but he was really a sweet guy. I did a podcast with him, the second last podcast I did on my podcasting channel, the Martian Drive-In Podcast. And I've put that up on YouTube about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, when Garfield and I had a chat for an hour or two by phone, just shooting the shit about movies. He was a lovely guy. He supported what I was doing. He supported what a lot of people were doing. He was very knowledgeable about films. One of his side gigs was to be Santa in shopping centres every Christmas, and he was really good at that. I've got a couple of friends who do that kind of gig, and it's always a fun gig. And the people who do that kind of gig are always lovely guys. Vale to Graham Garfield Barnard, also known as Nigel Honeybone. I'll post a link to the podcast episode that Garfield and I did, which is already up on the YouTube channel, but I'll point you in that direction. Really a lovely guy, and I'll miss him. So sorry to leave you on a somber note at the end of the video. As always, please consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment, hitting the notification bell as well. You can also support the channel by donating a few bucks at patreon.com/paleocinema. And please, look after yourselves. Be safe. Appreciate the people around you and the people who have the same passion you have. Watch some good old movies, watch some bad old movies. Watch some of the B movies that really don't get enough love. And I'll catch you next time.